Alright, what's going on? It's Keatsta, the internet's busiest music nerd, kicking off our lists with the top 10 albums I enjoyed in 2024. Uh, I listened to like a decent amount of music this year. In past years, I lamented that my music obsession seems to have waned quite a bit since when I was a teenager, since when I had more time and opportunity and more of a hunger for new music. And now I've kind of made peace with that. I definitely did try to deliberately find more opportunities to listen to music, don't always default to putting on a sitcom or a YouTube video while doing work. Sometimes let's check out a new album that seems interesting. And because of that, I ended up increasing my intake quite a bit this year. What I also noticed, though, is that the range of music I'm interested in, or rather, it's not so much the range of music I'm interested in, but the sort of range of musical experiences I want to have, is getting a little bit narrower. Like, music used to be what I turned to if I was feeling very despairing or very stressed, or if I couldn't sleep, or if I was just really upset, depressed, whatever. If I was feeling manic, these were all moods that had very strong soundtracks in my life, that had albums that I really strongly associate with those moments and those feelings. And nowadays it's kind of like, well, I'm kind of just chilling. Not that my life is perfect or anything, but I think I've kind of just started coping in different ways. And now having music that sort of befits negative moods isn't really something I turn to as often. And accompanying that, I just don't seek out music that reminds me of those sorts of things as often, which does feel a little bad. I feel like I ought to leave space for those sorts of things, to appreciate them, even if I don't, experience them in such empathetic, intense depth. So to that end, there was an amazing Godspeed You Black Emperor album this year that I listened to like once or twice, but just didn't really get into. There's a new Mount Erie album that I'm sure I would have adored, but I just seemed like too sad, and I didn't really feel like listening to it. So I've noticed, that the things I'm drawn towards have shifted over the years, even if I make kind of an effort to allow myself to be drawn where I am. That's just how it is. It's you just got to be honest with yourself, honest with your tastes. So let's get into number 10 on our list. We have this fine young man with an excellent haircut. This is Tyler the Creator's Chromacopia. And this is his 8th album. And with it, he continues what I think is the biggest evolution in hip hop. It's always raw and honest, or authentically dishonest in some cases, presenting the real dishonesty that he finds himself entrapped in. These series of albums of late have really served as very personal diary entries, I feel like. Expressions of his latest self out into the world. Two typos on this first slide. Not a great sign. Whatever. Let's go. Here, having already wrestled through some of his most acutely painful albums, the feelings of coming out, sort of the rage and mistrust of his early career, self acceptance, all those things. He gets a little bit more forward thinking here, and he climbs a bit further up on kind of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs in his life, towards not just self acceptance, but self actualization. Obviously, he's very self actualized as an artist, but now we see him trying to make sense of who he is as a human being, challenging himself to accept the role or lack thereof of his parents in his childhood. This is a major theme of the album. There's interludes, spoken word by his mom. We get some pretty powerful revelations about who his father was in his life and the choices his father made and the choices his mother made. While, recognizing in a complex fashion, but owning and embracing the fact that in many ways he has grown into his parents. There's a really powerful speech by his mother where he's being compared to his father and all the qualities that he shares. And you can feel that this is maybe hard for him to totally reckon with, given this sort of strenuous, complicated relationship he has with his parents. But over the course of the album, you feel like he is truly embracing it to an extent and seeing it as part of the great, complex, wonderful puzzle that is himself. And then, a sort of natural jumping off point from thinking about your parents while being at the age, presumably around the age that your parents had you. This is the big question for people mine and Tyler's age. Do I want to have a kid myself? That's something that a lot of my friends are asking themselves these days and having discussions about and really trying to have a breakthrough on their own feelings. And honestly, these themes and topics, which are not uncommon fare for musicians, especially musicians in this sort of phase of their life and their career, kind of bother me. Especially the kid one, mulling over whether or not you want to have a kid on an album. For some reason, well, I know what reason, but we don't need to get into it. It kind of irritates me. I'm not going to lie. Often when artists I love, while they struggled, there's a lot of artists that in their difficult times, in their rough patches, really, really appeal to me, really resonate with me. And then as they become happy and fulfilled and start tackling kind of the greater projects of life and move beyond depression or anxiety or failure or whatever, they kind of lose their edge for me. They become less interesting. Not that I consider myself a miserable person or whatever, but I did in the past, and sometimes hearing a happy album from somebody I used to see as kind of like a comrade, it throws me for a loop. And even more upsetting to me is when they're at this stage of self-realization and they've kind of succeeded in so many ways, and now they're writing about kind of either the trials and tribulations of their success, and or oh, well, now it's an option for me. I can have a kid. I can start a family because, I'm in that position in life where that's a possibility. It's these aren't real problems. Why are you still kind of writing in the same way you did when you had real serious mental health issues? And now it's the kind of same introspection and delving and challenging yourself, but it's these sorts of luxurious problems. But Tyler is different. That's typically the case. That's how I felt about Charlie's album this year. It really bugged me along those axes. But Tyler is different because I really did watch this guy grow up. I've been listening to Odd Future since 2009. I've been listening to Tyler since the very first mixtapes. I watched this guy change in so many ways alongside me. I feel like our paths are very parallel and twinned in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's still kind of a feeling of okay, well, good for you, it does still kind of bug me, but I'm also genuinely very, very proud of him. I truly am. He has blown away all of my expectations in terms of being an artist and being a human being. And plus, also, on top of, all of this very kind of high-level therapeutic introspection, he just, lets the fuck loose on this in his production, which has just gotten only more interesting and masterful, and the fun tracks that are thrown in that swerve totally off base thematically and are just him letting loose with one of the most unique and punchy and fun and silly voices in hip-hop when he wants to be, I air this bitch out like a queef. Well, that's a guest verse, but whatever. He says some funny stuff on that one. There's just certain modes in his kind of artistic career where he just gets better and better and better. And he never totally drifts away from that. And even in his most serious, even in his most vulnerable, introspective places, he still hits you with the 101 stuff, the stuff he's been refining since day one of Odd Future. Really good. The recommended tracks I would have for this album are Hey Jane, which I think it's all about, a pregnancy scare and trying to decide whether or not it's the right time to have a kid. And stuff that I said, yeah, that kind of bugs me, but it's done really, really well. Just very full of emotion, very vulnerable, very clever, I think, in the way that it's written from two different perspectives, and you can kind of build up this entire narrative between them. Really, really impressive, excellent stuff. And then Balloon, which is just an extremely goofy, extremely fun track that I listened to like 30 times in a row when I first heard it. Yeah, that is number 10. Moving right along to this odd vehicle, I believe. Yeah, it must be. This is Pasta's Grand Pop. Now, let me make a proclamation here that I have made in the past. Future bass will never die. It will only continue to evolve. And here we have a wild collective from Japan. It's combining like 18 different musical sensibilities into one extremely fun, extremely funky package. It's like wildly nonsensical, but still having this like very tight, very smart mentality. It doesn't feel like indulgent. It doesn't feel like it does things to any sort of unreasonable excess. There's no sense of just like showing off or anything. Everything is laser focused into one cohesive musical experience that at the same time just contains such insanely varied, insanely surprising, insanely enjoyable elements. There's rapping, there's breakbeats, there's Vocaloid. And of course, because it's future bass, you gotta hit the big seventh chords as the foundation for your melodies. We got bro steppy wubs, but then guitar riffs that sound like they're in a kind of traditional anime ED sound, and just like big ass funky beats absolutely everywhere. Another typo. There's very funny samples, moments of pastiche, and then moments of sincerity where they kind of play something very pastiche-y, so straight, so kind of like by the book. Okay, we're gonna have this like bass riff, and it's gonna be like kind of jazzy, beboppy, and you're like, is this kind of a joke? Like because it is so bizarrely juxtaposed with everything else going on in the song, but it's so sincere too. Like there's no real joke within it. It's just a very well executed bass line. Basically, we still have the musical fixations in terms of just generally the soundscape and the tonal modes, you know, as I mentioned, spamming big seventh chords, having that nice, bright, funky, future bassy sound. But I feel like this project inherits the mentality of hyperpop in terms of just delighting in juxtaposing elements and delighting in bringing in that sort of hypertextual reference to an entirely other genre or an entirely other movement, just by making like musical motif references. I don't know how old anyone in this group is. I didn't really do any research into who these people are. I'm, not in touch with these musical scenes in Japan as much as I wish I could be. But this album feels both extremely Zoomer coded, just in that sort of like hyper poppy ADHD, random assortment, freewheeling sampling of genres. But it also feels very nostalgic. Like it reminds me of my favorite future bass songs from way back in the day. It just sort of recalls those elements and gets me back into the mood of when I first heard those songs. And this is basically the Gex formula. I think super zoomer coded construction of elements that are nostalgic for listeners my age. But here, obviously with working from Japan and working from the future based sensibility and all sorts of different genres, all sorts of different touch points get shuffled in to form the true base, the foundation of everything on this album. I think what really compels me about this sort of music, just this kind of spectrum of very diverse, very genre shifting songs, is a sense of confidence. There's this jazzy, freewheeling sensibility to every element that gets tossed in the mix, where you get a feeling, even though you know this is impossible, of just musicians kind of having a session, throwing things in on whims, on impulses, just knowing that it feels right in the moment. And yet it's, in actuality, just based on how this music must have been constructed, it's so much more deliberate than that, and there's actually so much more like confidence and forethought that has to get put into these decisions. Like when you add an element that may at first kind of seem memey, seem more like pastiche than something kind of sincerely articulated as like a musical theme, it still has to be sincerely good. You know, it still has to succeed as the thing you are creating a pastiche of. It still has to truly work within the mix of everything else that's going on. You can't just phone it in. So in composition, this requires, which is especially impressive across a collective that has frequent guests and stuff, just this sort of feeling of like, okay, well now you drop a sick verse here. Okay, like give us like 18 bars on this. 18 bars, 16 bars, 8 bars, whatever. All right, now we're gonna then incorporate like a guitar riff, and that's sort of like echoing the melodic flows of that verse. Okay, you feel me? And now grab a double bass, or at least a convincing synth, and just kind of have this nice plucked walking bass line uh, at double time that just sort of bridges us into the rest of the song. Like, how the fuck do you do that? How do you operate with such confidence that you can nail each and one of those individual elements, and that the slurry of all of them you're creating is going to sound so good? So my recommended tracks are Byunji, which just has some crazy verses and explosive action, and this, which means like manners. I can't remember how to pronounce it, but has like a really, really kind of catchy vocal chorus and stuff. Some really kind of like poppy sensibilities, while still kind of subtly weaving in all sorts of other really, really sonically interesting things. All right, great stuff. Let's move on to number 8. This intricate looking tapestry. This is the latest album by Fortet 3. IDM will never die either. It's always going to be there for you. And it feels like maybe it's already max evolved. My periods of interest in IDM wax and wane, but the genre itself keeps moving forward. There's still such dedicated, talented people creating new IDM compositions every single year. Such that when I kind of have an interest peak again, and I want to listen to some IDM, there's always a stockpile of really lovely albums for me to explore that I had just never heard before, that have been released since my last burst of interest. This time, I was reintroduced to Fortet at really a perfect time, I think. I just saw a review, I think, for this album, and it actually was, just the exact thing I needed at that time. I had just been laid off, so I was very stressed from unemployment. So I needed something that I think kind of escapes for me, that brought me along to just a totally different musical soundscape, into something that could be very soothing, very distracting. But I didn't want it to just be like, totally calm, totally lush or whatever. Instead, I wanted something that would engage me as well. I was playing a ton of Balatro at the time, and I wanted something to listen to that would feel stimulating, just to the right extent, just to kind of keep me focused on my runs. And this just hits such a sweet spot of calming and entrancing, but also engaging, also stimulating, with such a juicy and lush natural sound. A feeling of things kind of just slowly emerging and subsiding within each other, as they ought to. Like a compositional style that isn't out to shock you. Even when it does surprise you, it feels correct and natural that there would be a surprise there. Something that truly kind of sweeps you along into the world of the music. Sometimes you have the ambient swelling shoreline. Sometimes a brace of thunder. There's some very nice abrasive elements on this album that rolls in from the horizon. Sometimes the steady beats of whitecap waves. And then sometimes in isolation, these glittering jewels of life buzzing about within a tide pool left by the receding tide. And sometimes all of these things all at once. I love too the feeling that on none of these tracks does it feel like the songs are rushing past you. The progression feels more like everything is sort of coexisting as they're presented to you. It feels more like a mandala or a fractal, that's very, very complex, but repeating in certain ways, that's kind of graspable as a whole, but then rewards study and contemplation and it's just sort of spread out before you to study at your leisure. I really don't have a whole lot to say about this one, which I suppose is kind of the point. That's part of the appeal. The tracks I would recommend are Daydream Repeat, which is what I was listening to when I wrote this hopefully evocative description of a shoreline of music. That's the one that contains all of those elements kind of rolling into one another. And Three Drums, the finale, which is just such a incredible musical voyage. All right, 1 second. I'm going to take my hoodie off. Whew. It's overheating a little bit. And I'm going to grab a Tums. I had spicy food for dinner, which is not really conducive to talking for a long period after, but those are the challenges we set for ourselves on the Keats to YouTube channel. I'll check my Slack messages quick too. Okay. Out to number 7, we have Petrichor. The smell of rain, or rather the smell of earth having been recently rained upon. This is the latest album by 070 Shake. What a journey for Shake, you know? My dark horse fave, who leapt out to me as such an amazing talent, as someone I really wanted to watch. Way back when she first had guest verses on Kanye's album, when she dropped the Glitter EP. And it's a journey that I think is only like 1/5 over at most. I feel like we are still just kind of on the starting blocks of all the stuff she's going to be able to achieve as an artist. It feels now more than ever that she's capable of making anything. This is in many ways her biggest project yet. She's got amazing guests on this, including Courtney Love, of all people, sings a really beautiful verse on one of the songs. The production has leveled up yet again into another tier of both professionalism and diversity. She feels so expert in making so many kind of different styles and moods within her songs. And moments, you know, where it feels like maybe she is giving some consideration to future tours. Truly beltable, stadium-sized anthems, accompanied by synth megachords, grooving bass lines, things that I don't think are necessarily like catering to mainstream tastes, but things that wouldn't feel out of place in those contexts either. Like, just sort of succeeding at making those sorts of approachable, inspiring, powerful tracks that still contain so much of herself. But yeah, because none of this has dulled her hyper interesting instincts, and she still indulges in every single burst of creativity in so many different directions on this album. Some songs start as real surefire pop successes, where it kind of feels like, oh yeah, you're writing a radio hit right now. I could hear this on a TikTok or whatever. But then it kind of bends into a direction that is sometimes quite cruelly ironic, or kind of reveals the beginning of the track to be sort of a wistful desire, being expressed by a much more upset and sometimes quite miserable kind of poetic speaker, and then everything just kind of swerves into another much more intense, much less approachable direction. Sometimes, you know, it's even simpler than that, and a song that sort of starts with a very approachable melody will get overwhelmed by a lava tide of noise, static, booming drums. And in these moments where the music becomes quite noisy, quite abrasive, those are when the subject matter of the album becomes more painful as well, that she becomes so confessional, so afraid, so kind of horrified at the prospect of the life that's before her. This music still feels very deeply, painfully therapeutic in a very still compelling way. It's quite different than where Tyler's at, I'll say that for sure. Like, you know, yeah. Will Charlie have a baby? Will she move to Naples? I'm on the edge of my seat. No, no. Sheikah is like going through some stuff on this. But the thing is, she's going through some stuff, but it's very different than the stuff she was going through back in 2017, back in 2020, back in 2022. All of these albums are really showing us different glimpses, different slices of where she's at, you know, emotionally, mentally, in terms of her lifestyle. There are changes and there is progress and there is a lot of growth and triumph and discovery. And I still find it resonates with me. The stuff she said way back on the Glitter EP resonated with me like really, really, really deeply. And the stuff she's saying now, I still feel it reverberate. I've changed and she's changed, but you know, there's still so much pain in life, so much uncertainty. I said before I was chilling, and that's true. I'm doing better than I've ever been doing, really. But life is hard, man. Life is really hard. And I'm glad to have music that acknowledges that. I'm glad that not all of my faves have just become upstanding, morally centered, accomplished people that might start families. Her lyrics feel like personal fixations for her. The language she uses feels like a very personal language that she articulates secrets within that we're not really meant to understand. With these diary excerpt references, you know, just very vague and oblique lines referring to incidents that we don't know about. And yet we still feel as well, okay, well, I don't quite understand exactly what the time you had is, but I know that I have times like that too. We all have times like that too, right? You know, I hope she keeps doing better. I hope that all of the challenges she faces on this album, she keeps tackling in turn. I hope her relationship with the daughter of Johnny Depp, Lily Rose Depp, goes wonderfully. They're quite the couple. And I hope I continue tackling everything in my life, turn by turn as well. Yeah, my recommended tracks are Into Your Garden, just a really cool, very driving song with a lot of very dissonant with one another, but individually super compelling elements. There's like a rap verse on there and stuff. And then Blood on Your Hands, which is a extremely painful, extremely vulnerable, really kind of pitiable moment on the album where she expresses just this sort of despair and lust for death and for this sort of like hellish reliance upon her girlfriend and just this like intense difficulty that they seem to be going through that of course I don't really know the details of, but and then she's met in return by a soliloquy from Lily Rose Depp that I find really, really beautiful and just sort of the counterpoint very touching. So yeah, check it out. Great stuff. I think she'll just keep making cooler and cooler music. She's just going crazy. All right, next we got Chief Keef with his long-awaited sequel to the definitive mixtape, the mixtape that really put him on the map, Almighty So. This is Almighty So 2. It's crazy to think that we're like 10 plus years deep into the Chief Keef era, which I don't think has ever really truly ended. People are still out there making drill. Drill will never die either. And if drill never dies, it's because Chief Keef infused it with so much life 10 years ago. I remember when he was the next big thing. I remember listening to I Don't Like, and it sounded like absolutely nothing I'd ever heard. How insane I felt when Kanye did the remix, just like finding out about this young kid kind of coming up out of nowhere and then being acknowledged by the biggest hip-hop musician to ever come out of Chicago. The intro to Love Sosa, the first time I heard that, I thought I might scream. I just felt so jacked up and energized. When I went to visit Chicago with a friend of mine, we had this like running joke that, well, Chief Keef's under house arrest right now, and we know where his house is, so we can go visit Chief Keef. He has to be there. He has to be there. We can go hang out with him, which of course we did not do. But that was a cultural moment that really really changed my mind on like a lot of what I understood to be music, what I saw of as like the limitations of hip hop, the extremes of hip hop. That is like he blew down doors in my mind. And even crazier, that a decade later, a decade after that experience, he has evolved so much. He is so good on this album. He is just such an amazing rapper now. Like, it sounds maybe redundant. It probably goes without saying because I put this on a list of my favorite albums. But man, this is just so good. It's so cinematic, so fully realized, so ambitious, so huge. It feels like it has the scope and the grandness of like a Kanye album. But it's Chief Keef, baby. Chief Keef is the one making it. So many features that all go so hard. This is another defining feature of some of my favorite hip hop albums is they bring on guests who aren't there just to kind of give a good verse, even a great verse, but they want to give a verse that is like a true representation of what they're about, that leans into the most extreme qualities that made them on their own superstars. And I think here everybody is on their A game, on their S game. There's these running interludes by the comedian Michael Blackson. I find them very, very funny. I crack up listening to this album. Not just the skits, but a lot of Chief Keef's lines I think are just hilarious. And I would say it's like on the verge of poignancy too. There's some kind of rants that he gets into about, I don't know, like reparations and stuff, where he's not trying to make any sort of point, but it just feels so revealing of like the various complexes and I don't know, it's like quite interesting, I think. I sound extremely white saying this, but whatever. And he's so consistently funny. Every verse has like 10 plus memorable bars. Just everything he says on this is either like genuinely witty and clever or is just like so obnoxious and direct, like intentionally so, that it just kind of like slaps you in the face with something so ridiculous that you can't help but laugh. And again, it kind of skirts around the edge of poignancy. There's no real attempt to be sentimental here. There's no kind of like boring slow song where he reflects on his legacy. But instead, the sort of things he says speak for themselves. That when he talks about his lifestyle and he's kind of talked about how he's built it up, when he's talking about how things have changed from him since he was just a teenager, talking about all of the successes and stuff he's had, it really makes you think. It really makes you look back at his career and really feel a little bit odd. Yeah, it's not sentimental. It's not like balanced where he's trying to kind of like weigh two different qualities of his life and reflect on maybe there was like losses on the road or whatever. But rather it's just about kind of creating this awe around the sublime career that he's built. Probably the best part for me is just all of these things are great and there's so much of everything. It's like an hour long. Most of the songs are 4+ minutes. So every flow he has, every idea he has for like a pattern on a verse, every guest is given so much space to breathe, to really show their stuff. It doesn't feel at all like this was rushed, that anything was compromised. Instead, it's just like the full fruition of every sort of impulse he has on this entire project. It's so good. It's just so good. I want to listen to it now. The songs I'd recommend, Jesus, where he just has such an imposing, powerful flow and kind of alternates between saying some genuinely powerful, kind of stunning phrases and then just some of the most stupid jokes on the album. And Grape Trees, a very funny, very catchy, very fun track with Sexy Red, where both of them have free reign to just like insult people, shitting on folks, and it's a hoot. Okay, next we have a very, 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 very different album. This is Bright Future by Adrienne Lenker, who is one part of the folk band Big Thief. And I've been a Big Thief fan for a while. And I'd always been curious about Adrian's solo albums, and I listened to them. I didn't get as much into them because to me the Big Thief appeal was taking these like very sort of whispery, small, fragile elements produced by, each band member kind of subtly and feeling them all weave together into something truly mighty, something upon which you can kind of climb high and feel like such a grand, large perspective has been opened up to you just on the strength of all of these sort of svelte, flowing elements up together. I have a very strong mental image in my head of what I'm trying to convey here, and I'm not sure if I'm conveying it in my words very well. So when elements were presented in isolation, as in her solo work, which is much more stripped down, doesn't have as many instrument parts on it, instead I kind of felt a longing listening to it. It felt like something was missing, and that I was sort of grasping at simply air instead. So what changed here is that I finally felt that air being crystallized before me. These stories that she tells on these songs are so realized, so intimate and rich with detail, unfolding like a lattice. Cryptic allusions to familiar lore that resonate with you on the gut level. She kind of tells a story semi-obliquely, making reference to some incident in the past, but from the context, from the presentation, it's that sort of thing. In the same way that maybe you're getting to know somebody and they make some oblique reference to, I don't know, their uncle, and everyone else in the family kind of just murmurs, and you're like, oh, it's that sort of thing. Well, at other times, she rambles off anecdotes with such joviality, a feeling of supper time recollections of just funny moments in the past, of reminiscing about different lifestyles, different settings, different people, not really even necessarily needing a narrative thrust to them, not needing some sort of point to be proven, but just remembering for the sake of remembering for the fun of sharing stories. Everything combines in these moments of personal epiphany. I think my favorite moments on the album are where in the climax of the song, she kind of presents this realization of, well, that would actually explain all of this long behavior, the fact that deep down, this was how they felt. I'm sorry I can't give a more concrete example. It's not that I want to spoil anything. It's just that, as I said, a lot of these songs are still quite cryptic as well, and I'm going to feel so foolish if I'm like, yeah, it was a story about her dad's vulnerability. And then I look it up later. I'm not even going to think that somebody would call me out, but I imagine I'm going to look it up later, and it's like, this is a story about her dad, becoming an alcoholic. And I'm like, what? The important thing, though, is that I feel that moment of crystallization, that moment of epiphany, where suddenly everything in the story previous kind of adds up, that it kind of clicks together. It's light as air, but glitteringly complex. It's something that you feel lingering in your palm as at the same time as it sweeps through your fingers. You feel it breeze away as soon as you felt it at all. And I feel like the compositions on this album are so much more kind of complex and varied and compelling to me than her previous solo work. And not that that was bad or anything, it just didn't hook me the same way. But here it gets to that level of really almost Baroque folk precision that really enchants me. It has, the richness and depth and just sort of instrument to instrument interplay of my favorite works by the whole Big Thief band. But it still feels so unique. Because I think one of the strengths of Big Thief is that in their compositions, they really are all peers. They're all equals. There's no clear band leader. But here, the compositions really do feel like they are all swirling out and around Adrienne herself. It gives a different sense of focus, a different sense of intimacy and personality that I found really, really interesting and found, again, super compelling. The two songs I'd recommend are the opener, Real House, which is definitely the most minimal song on the album. Just this extremely haunting piano, her very whispery, wistful voice recounting the story of a move from her childhood. And the rambunctious Vampire Empire, which I think was like a live show favorite, now finally with a studio release. She just goes off on this thing. I don't know. It's like a hootenanny. I couldn't really tell you what it was about. Honestly, I think it might not be that dissimilar to the Vampire Castle that Mark Fisher wrote about. I think it's basically like about people that will drain from you because of their unhealthy behaviors and sort of escaping the trap of placating unreasonable people and stuff. I think I'd have to listen to it again. Anyways, great album. Now we will move on to number 4, which is Only God Was Above Us by Vampire Weekend. Guess what, motherfuckers? The white man's indie is back. It was here in 2008 with the self-titled album. It came back in 2013 with Modern Vampires of the City. And now it is gigaback with my favorite Vampire Weekend album yet. Vampy Wiki always represented for me this sort of agreeable area of the indie rock Venn diagram. And this is what I refer to by white man's indie. It's a very specific subgenre of indie rock that, it's not a never die genre. It is a has died many, many, many deaths genre. Because you had your music by and for freaks, which is what I loved. That was the indie rock that I was into during the early 2000s in my teenage years. Animal Collective, the first works of Arcade Fire, before they became whatever they are now. And then you had your radio-ready, kind of jaunty bullshit music that was by and for popular kids. And for the most part, I just sort of tolerated this as kind of the accompanying genre to the genre that I really enjoyed. There was tracks within it that I really liked. I think you could uncharitably put like Metric, some other rough trade type or arts and crafts, bands on there. Maps. By the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, I can think of as this sort of like jaunty, popular indie rock genre at the time. And then I think that pathway of the genre has now truly twisted into one of my least favorite genres ever, which is like the stomp, clap, insufferable arena indie, totally contradictory with all of its modes and messaging and sort of media landscape appearances. I'm glad that trend is waning. Those were a rough few years. Again, uncharitably, I think we can put most of the blame on Feist. But then we started getting such horrid acts as like the Ex-Ambassadors or the Lumineers or there's a local one, the Beaches or something, and it's basically like, what if rich kids who have never had a problem were trying to rip off Wolf Parade? And guess what? It sucked. But with Vampy Wiki, there was like an agreeable middle zone. I can summarize exactly how I felt about them. I was at a music festival. I was mostly there to see Arcade Fire, and I could see that Urza Koing, I think is his name, the frontman of Vampire Weekend, was standing on the periphery of the stage wearing a suit and just sort of watching all the other bands. And at the time, I wasn't like super into Vampy Wiki. They had that song A-Punk, and I was like, yeah, that's pretty catchy, but I don't know, it's not like amazing, I just want to listen to Panda Bear play the snare drum nonstop for 45 minutes until his hands start bleeding. That's more my cup of tea. So I was like, ah, who does this guy think he is? And then their set started, and he came out in like sunglasses and shorts, and he's just jumping and bouncing around the stage, and he's just having such a blast. And I was like, I kind of misjudged you. You're not self serious at all. Um, in the end, it's like, you know, music about either having fun or failing to have fun. um, I can get down with that. I can enjoy, you know, having a blast with you guys. On this album, I think all of the best qualities of this mindset are concentrated into extremely great, extremely tight package. It's sprawling with big ideas, you know, every track is basically a little short story of someone's personal philosophy being put to test. There's characters established and then subverted when they're suddenly shoved into an epiphany about who they are, about their lifestyle. This is Dubliners core. This is the writing style of James Joyce writing the greatest short story compilation ever produced, Dubliners. And I'll just a bit. I'm not gonna go so far as to call this Joycean or anything, but I think they do a really good job of just sort of very rapidly establishing a scene and then sort of taking you on this very significant journey in that moment in that character's life. Despite that, though, there's no pretentiousness, and I think this is what makes the band work so much for me. There's no fart-smelling cleverness. Everything is secondary to just maintaining great, complex, but very catchy grooves, sing-along choruses, intriguing sound structures. You know, they're still out here just writing tunes, and they sound great. It just sounds so good. Just this smooth, clean, jazzy sound with so many interesting elements as he rattles off these really fascinating stories. Yeah, it's not freaky. It's pretty far on the Venn diagram from, I don't know, Spirit They're Gone, Spirit They Vanished. But it's good, man. It just hits the spot. The tracks I'd recommend are one of the opening ones, Classical, which is kind of an interesting, somewhat parodious riff on sort of arpeggios and other classical themes and motifs, and Pravda, which of course is the Russian word for press, right? It's like the Soviet newspaper was called Pravda. I think it just means like press. But that's a very compelling small piece near the end before the big final sprawling track. Really beautiful, very wistful, very almost capital R romantic music. Okay, moving into the top three, here is probably someone no one is surprised to see, my good guy Kendrick Lamar, who I've been a huge, huge fan of ever since Good Kid, Mad City. And honestly, though, he could have put out an album that's just 45 minutes of farts, and I probably would have put it at like number 10 on this list, just for what he did to Drake. And I don't need to go into like a whole big tangent on this, although I kind of want to. We all know it happened. And it's not like I'm even going to act like, oh, I always hated Drake. I was a day zero Drake hater. No, no, no. He's got like a lot of tracks I love. I could name pretty easily over 20 Drake tracks that I truly adore, that I think are catchy, that I think are bangers. Even ones that I have found very emotionally significant. But he has completely fallen off in like the last 5 or so years. I think the last song that I thought was good, and I didn't even think it was that good, I was just like, oh, this is catchy, was Laugh Now, Cry Later. And everything I've heard after that, just stinker after stinker after stinker. His albums have just become like turds. Like, his albums were never his strong suit, you know? It's all about singles. Even the albums that contain some of my favorite songs also contain just some like total dog water music. But now it's like there's not even good tracks on these. It's just straight turd. And like, he is a bad person. He's a really bad person. You know, he's addicted to gambling. He's addicted to booze and drugs and pills. He's addicted to young women. And it's like, oh, I'm not trying to like shit talk an addict or whatever. Gambling addiction, that's serious, that's scary, but like he's proud of it. He makes no effort to change. There's no sense of like self perspective. There's no sense of self awareness. There's no sense that he wants to mature and grow as a person. He's just this like perpetually 23-year-old Toronto man's this like the most pathetic person you've ever met, and is just still going around flaunting his wealth, still going around complaining about girls, still blowing money on online casinos. It's embarrassing. And I'm so sick of the way the Toronto lionizes him. And it's not anywhere near as bad as it used to be, but it's still bad enough. We still see that freaking OVO owl way too often. It's pathetic. We can do better. We have way more talented musicians that we should be propping up. Frankly, Drake should be propping up. He hasn't done shit for the local music scene at all. All right, putting aside the diss tracks being the best musical thing of the year, such cathartic, amazing moments, so triumphant, so satisfying. I listened to Not Like Us like 300 times. Those are my top 5 song of the years right there. Everything from Like That to Not Like Us. But let's put that aside. What's going on with GNX? This is just another crazy good, infinitely listenable, studyable, memeable, great album from Mr. Kendrick Lamar. It doesn't hit the highs of Mr. Morale for me, but that was an album that I legitimately consider life-changing. And this, it doesn't need to be life-changing. Not every album needs to be life-changing. Your life would change too often. His skill in building narratives and moods, fusing beats and producers, and of course rapping, his sheer rapping ability just makes any project with any sort of goal, any sort of scale, any sort of ambition, whether it's something that's meant to be like a total mental picture of himself a la Mr. Morale, whether it's meant to be some sort of anthem for a pained black community like To Pimp a Butterfly became. No matter what it is he's doing, it's always worthy of this level of attention. The spices in the sauce on this time, the things that make this one unique and quite interesting, on I think every track and almost every verse. There's maybe a couple that I can think of that don't, but almost all of them, he takes some more shots at Drake, which is great. Except for the Heart Part 6, where I don't think he has any allusions, any subliminals pointing at Drake, but the existence of the track itself, where he just completely ignores the fact that Drake also released something called The Heart Part 6, and just makes the real Heart Part 6, and goes like, yeah, no, fuck you. That in itself, I think, is such a mean and powerful diss, and it's literally just the like, well, I don't even think about you meme. Plus a further embrace, I think, of his own meminess. This is something that I feel like he has been exploring and leaning into more and more, going back to like the Baby Keem collaborations, where he just seems to get a big kick out of saying things that he knows will be repeated a million times over. And he's getting like really good at it, like way better than you would think a rapper that won like a Pulitzer would be. Of course, there's the Screaming Mustard. Everybody loves that one, but there's all sorts of things on this album that I find really funny just because they're so odd. And they just become these little brainworms in my head. And I think one of the more unique aspects of this record is the integration of some really raw sounding LA rappers, none of whom I had heard of before, that drop like these really menacing verses in just this super unique kind of scowling, bitter style, flowing to like such a extreme expert degree. Really, really compelling stuff. Plus liberal usage of SZA. Should just do a whole album together. I know they talked about it. She appears on many tracks just singing so angelically, providing such a perfect counterbalance to the kind of rugged and rawness on so many other tracks. It's kind of like a distillation of aspects of her talent that I think sometimes get overlooked because she's such an amazing rapper as well and such an amazing songwriter. But she just has this like amazing angelic voice that is allowed to just soar freely on this one. So my recommended tracks are Whacked Out Murals, the opener. It's just so epic. It goes in so many different directions. He just seems to be speaking his mind on everything and everything, anything and everything. And Hey Now, which has one of my favorite guest verses, and just sounds so cold, so intense. I listened to it a bunch at a Smash tournament where I made a couple upsets. So I was like, yeah. Yeah, I'm so lame. But I'm like only about as lame as Drake, I think. Saying, yeah, I listened to Hey Now, because that song's about the ops. And I took down my ops in Project Plus, a modification of Smash Brothers Brawl to make it more like Smash Brothers Melee. I think that is, at worst, only equally embarrassing to a lot of the shit Drake has said. Alright. Next we have the latest album from Serpent with Feet. This is Grip. After making Blisters, which is like the most heartbreaking, most suicide core soul music I have ever heard, which is, you know, there's some contenders in that category, but man, that is a bleak project. And then following that up with this long and complicated arc towards happiness expressed across 2 albums, I was like, okay, well, good for him. And this is, as I was talking about back on the Tyler write-up, I was like, I'm really happy that his life seems good now and that he is happy and that he is fulfilled and comforted. But this is not as interesting as when you were sad. I'm sorry. And I did not, every subsequent release I got into less and less. So it's a dilemma. I was like, okay, well, I want him to be happy, but I want more bangers that are as compelling and urgent and intense and almost, maybe unsettling isn't quite the right word, but just that sort of goosebumps sensation. So what could the next album be that would entice me? What could be good for him? The answer is horniness. This is probably the horniest album I've ever heard. It is just unbridled gay lust across 10 extremely fiery tracks. It's animalistic, sweaty, drooling, pulsating, thrusting, pillow clutching, gripping. While also being like really genuinely sweet at times, so romantic at times, full of just this very lush, very fruitful intensity of the physical sensations of falling in love. You know, it's not just lust, it's not just empty sex or totally casual or whatever. It's about that intensity of emotions that comes from great sex, from intense physical compatibility, of intense admiration and love for your partner, blending into this intoxicating slurry where the sensational, the most raw, visceral experience is married together with such transcendent descriptions of his feelings for his lover. I think the thesis statement can be summed up in the title drop of the album, late into one of the final tracks. If God is a god at all, he lives in your grip. I think that's sort of the thesis statement of the place he's trying to get to on this album. And after building this gigantic cathedral of sex, there's also a total willingness to kind of take a step back and chuckle at it, you know? There's not a feeling of dismissal or downplaying how significant and powerful any of this is. But there's still playfulness. There's still fun, too. There's an acknowledgement that saying a line like that is both powerful and evocative and a little silly. But believe it or not, when I listen to this, I'm honest here. it's not that I'm like turned on myself. It doesn't really do it for me in that dimension, honestly. I think it could. I certainly think it could, but you know, it's a different lane than what I'm interested in. To say we don't have to get into it. But instead, when I listen to this, I am just so impressed. This is so good. And I feel like it is so soul bearing. It is so emotional and passionate and intense and enrapturing. It feels just as impressive as Blisters. It feels like it's drawing me into that extent. Even though the emotional space is completely different, even though it's nowhere near as upsetting or devastating, or this isn't going to make me cry, but it just amazes me how well done this is, how great his voice is, how amazing the compositional skills are, how varied and rich everything is. His feelings are so compelling, so enrapturing, that even if I'm not, in the same mood as him, so to speak, I'm in awe. I'm truly in awe of what he was able to accomplish on this. It's a masterpiece of horniness, that's for sure. The tracks I'd recommend are Black Air Force, a really sultry kind of club banger, which has an awesome guest rap verse in it. Just comprises so much of what I love about the production, the sounds of the album, his delivery, and Lucky Me, which is where the title drop is. I think that is the most kind of transcendentally sweet and sentimental song that just sort of reflects on the great miracle that is love, how wonderful it is to find somebody that you're so compatible with, and just his expression of how lucky he feels using a very explicit metaphor. I think just summarizes how happy I am for him on this album, but just what a font of joyous creativity it's inspired. Okay. Finally, in our number one position, we have a fledgling new artist, Ten Benja. This is his second project ever, 10 total. Just kidding. Sorry. Beautiful gay soul music lost out to straight dude R&B. At least this time. Ten Benja is kind of my new dark horse. Another musician that I sort of found out about incidentally. Was in a position where people could have noticed him. This got reviewed on Pitchfork, which is where I saw it. Truly is rising out of nowhere, like not a huge social media following or anything like that. Although, a quick anecdote, I was visiting some friends back in Waterloo, and I was talking to this guy who already we had a very strange kinship because we both really liked puree gummies. I was like, damn, it's not often that you find somebody else who understands the appeal of puree gummies. Turns out we had both been kind of fighting for the limited puree selection at our local TNT. So I already had this like affinity with him, and I knew he liked cool music. We'd talked about music quite a few times before. And then he was asking me, oh, what have you been listening to, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, ooh, I found out about like a really cool musician. I had never heard of him before, but I just happened to read a review of his newest work, and I loved it. Is this guy 1010 Benja, and he's like, "Oh, I know him. I'm doing some design work for him," and he pulls up like their Instagram DMs. I was like, "That's an insane coincidence." Because yeah, he's at that kind of level of fame where he's attracting an audience and building kind of a following. But he truly is rising up like out of nowhere, like out of total obscurity. He is not at a level of superstardom yet by any stretch. His music hit me like a revelation, though. The second I put on this album, I had heard nothing like this before. Never, ever. You can draw constructions. You can put it into the genre of R&B. You can find specific inspirations. Sure. But in this combination with some of these elements, with this kind of attitude and perspective towards composition, nothing like this. It's at once so maximal, with so many ideas crammed in to just these little tracks, with so many totally fresh sounds, things that I literally have never heard before in a song, being utilized in a beat or being used to offset his voice. And then shifting gears rapidly, it suddenly becomes so minimal, stripped down to just the necessary subset of say, an acoustic guitar banging out a little riff as he sings over it. And you're like, dang, this is just a good tune. This is just a catchy melody and a great hook, all orbiting around his voice. What a voice this guy has. It's so confident, so playful, willing to leap and yelp and cry. What gets me listening to this and his first album, which I went back to, Two Houses, I also think it's really fantastic, is how much he not only created this whole sound, this entire kind of soundscape in which he operates, but how much he's mastered it just in creating it. So quickly after its conception, he's able to do so much in this mode and in this space. Across just 2 projects in 6 years, the style hasn't really... It hasn't felt like, oh, it's like a one of one, it's just an oddity, it's an eclectic project that's weird and unusual. Instead, it's so refined and explored that you feel like it's just a really stellar example of a whole genre that you haven't heard of, a musical tradition that's been built up and refined since the 80s. But no, he's just sort of imported it from some parallel timeline where that's the case. And it represents like this deep dive into these musical styles that he himself has just created. Then within this mastery, there are moments of such manic abandon, such explosive flow where he just lets loose in one of 7 or 8 different directions. In just half an hour, short album, there's so many modes, so many instances of just totally taking over my brain and amazing me. I would say this album, which I heard near the start of the year, has truly become the soundtrack of 2024. Not just in that I listen to a lot, but just aspects of it are constantly looping in my head. A sound effect will just sort of jump in to punctuate another thought I had. It becomes the internal vocal stim album of the year, which I'm realizing more and more, especially in this kind of era of music listening where music is often an accompaniment to work. And because I don't have the time or focus to just listen to every significant new album that comes out, I stick with certain albums for longer periods and more situations. And so something like this or Scaring the Hose from a few years ago, they really kind of just like take over my internal voice. And, you know, as the typical neurodivergent person, I have all sorts of like weird vocal stems in my head. And I have like a lot of respect and adoration for albums that can kind of set me up with some exciting new vocal stems. The songs I would recommend off this one: Peacekeeper, definitely a standout track. On it, he raps in a flow unlike any I have ever heard before. It is just this bizarre, bubbling, foaming verse, extremely catchy, extremely addictive. You just want more and more and more of it. I played it on repeat probably like 50 times. And then Twin, which is much more typical for the rest of the album. Just a really gorgeous track with amazing vocal performances, that I think builds up this sort of argument for, you know, that he's really constructing amazing songs within this sort of tonal mode, within this soundscape. Okay, that's all for this list. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you check out some of these albums. Next up, we will have probably movies or maybe TV that I watched. We'll see. But that's all for now. Bye-bye.